Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of House Resolution 418. This is a bipartisan resolution offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, calling on the government of Burma to end its persecution of the Rohingya Muslims and respect the human rights of all ethnic and religious minority groups within Burma. The Rohingya Muslims are one of the most persecuted minority groups in the world. According to Burma's 1982 citizenship law, the Rohingya are prohibited from holding Burmese citizenship even though they have lived in Burma for generations after generations. For over 3 decades, the government of Burma has systematically denied the Rohingya even the most basic of human rights while subjecting them to unspeakable abuses. Since 2012, 140,000 Rohingya and other Muslims in Burma have been displaced by violence, with hundreds killed. On January 13, unknown assailants entered a village in Rakhine State and killed 48 people while they slept. This is what happens when a government refuses to recognize its own people. In fact, a non-governmental organization based in Southeast Asia recently disclosed credible documents detailing the full extent of state involvement in persecuting Rohingyas. Not long ago, the government of Burma expelled Doctors Without Borders from the country, denying once again the most basic of human rights. The government of Burma cannot claim progress toward meeting its goals for reform if it does not improve the treatment of Rohingya Muslims and other minority groups. The United States must prioritize the protection of human rights in its engagement with Burma. I urge the State Department to take off the rose-colored glasses and recognize that progress on human rights in Burma is indeed limited. Now is the time for the State Department to bring additional leverage to bear, and this resolution will help us do that. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of HRS 418, a resolution urging the government of Burma to end its persecution of the Rohingya people, and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my good friend and co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Mr. McGovern, the gentleman from Massachusetts, for authoring this important resolution. HRS 418 calls on the government of Burma to end its persecution of the Rohingya people and to respect the human rights of all ethnic and religious minority groups. The plight of the Rohingya gets very little public attention, and I'm pleased that this House is addressing the abuses they and other minorities have suffered. The State Department's 2013 country reports on human rights practices acknowledged, and I quote, credible reports of extrajudicial killings, rape, and sexual violence, arbitrary detentions and torture and mistreatment in detention, deaths in custody, and systematic denial of due process and fair trial rights overwhelmingly perpetrated against the Rohingya, unquote. Last month, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Burma stated that the recent developments in Burma reflect a, quote, long history of discrimination and persecution against the Rohingya Muslim community which could amount to crimes against humanity, unquote. The UN has also described the Rohingya community as virtually friendless because they are denied citizenship and face severe restrictions on marriage, employment, health care, education, and daily movement. In February, the Burmese government expelled Doctors Without Borders, and since then, deaths due to preventable complications during pregnancy have occurred on an almost daily basis in Rohingya camps, where pregnant women make up a quarter of the group's emergency referrals. Mr. Speaker, as the government of Burma transitions from decades-long military rule to a civilian government, it is important to hold it accountable for persistent human rights abuses. The killings, arbitrary detentions, and destruction of homes have caused 140,000 people to be internally displaced, and hundreds of thousands have been forced to flee to neighboring countries, including Thailand, Bangladesh, and Malaysia. If Burma truly seeks to rejoin the international community, the manner in which it treats its own people will be a key marker of the government's sincerity. Burma must abide by human rights principles of equality and human dignity, and this resolution calls upon the Burmese government to do just that. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.Res. 418, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Chabot. He is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, Mr. Speaker. I rise today as a strong supporter and co-sponsor of H.Res. 418, urging the government of Burma to end the persecution of the Rohingya people and respect internationally recognized human rights for all ethnic and religious minority groups within Burma. And I want to commend the gentleman from Massachusetts, my friend and colleague, Mr. McGovern, for offering this legislation, which is certainly timely, and we appreciate his leadership on this. As chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia and the Pacific, I believe it's imperative that the U.S. and the international community raise awareness of this ongoing crisis in Burma and the need for its government to respect the human rights of all its ethnic and religious minority groups, which it's clearly not doing at this time. Last year, we held 2 hearings in my subcommittee to examine the deteriorating human rights situation and ethnic unrest in Burma. It's become abundantly clear the political and social situation there is extremely fragile, and the continuing persecution of the minority Rohingya population is, just as was said, a profound crisis. Some 140,000 displaced Rohingya have been forced to live in camps described as open-air prisons. Doctors Without Borders was forced out by the Burmese government, and since then nearly 150 Rohingya have died of medically related causes. This particular photo illustrates the Doctors Without Borders clinic. It's shuttered. They're gone. The people are not getting the medical care that they're entitled to, and people are literally dying as a result of this. Further, mob violence has made a number of other international NGOs evacuate Burma for fear and being essentially excluded by the government, and they were doing good work for people who really needed it. We're in dire straits. The Burmese government has taken few, if any, steps to forge a peaceful, harmonious, and prosperous future for the Rakhine state. It is complicit in extrajudicial killings, rape, arbitrary detention, torture, deaths in detention, and for denial of due process and fair trial rights for the Rohingya. As these horribly repressed people who are afforded no identity by the Burmese government have been forced into camps, the Burmese government has confiscated their land, their homes and property for redistribution to the Buddhist Rakhine majority. A recent report by a group united to end genocide found that nowhere else in the world are there more precursors to genocide, signs that genocide may well happen, than in Burma right now. This is why I recently introduced H.R. 4377, the Burma Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2014, with my colleague from New York, a Democrat, Mr. Crawley. This legislation would place conditions on providing international military and educational training or for military financing assistance to the Burmese government. In light of the Burmese government's and military's complicity in these ongoing human rights abuses against the Rohingya and other ethnic groups, it's much too soon for us to be engaging at a level that provides U.S. foreign assistance to Burma's corrupt and abusive military. It concerns me that the administration still refuses to cooperate or detail what its strategy really is for the future of military engagement with Burma. Mr. Speaker, H.Res. 418 highlights the need for the U.S. and international community to continue pressuring Burma to end its blatant persecution and discrimination of the Rohingya population. I want to again thank Mr. McGovern, Mr. Franks, Mr. Pitts, and Mr. Smith for co-sponsoring this resolution. I believe passage of the resolution will send a strong message to the Burmese government, and I would urge my colleagues to support this measure. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back. Gentleman from California reserve. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield to the author of the resolution, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Engel, for yielding me the time and for his leadership on this and so many other issues of human rights. I also want to thank Chairman Royce for his support and Chairman Chabot. I appreciate all that you do for human rights. I admire all these gentlemen who are here on the floor. They have been outspoken for human rights not only in Burma but all around the world. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to rise in support of this resolution urging the government of Burma to end the persecution of the Rohingya people and respect internationally recognized human rights for all ethnic and religious minority groups within Burma. I especially want to also thank my good friend and colleague, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Congressman Joe Pitts, for his leadership on this issue and for joining me in introducing this bipartisan resolution. Over 800,000 people of Rohingya ethnicity live in Burma, mostly in the Rakhine state. Even though many Rohingyas have lived in the Rakhine for generations, the Burma Citizenship Law of 1982 has excluded them from approved ethnic groups, thereby rendering them stateless and vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and abuse. And while the Rohingya and other minorities in Burma have historically experienced severe discrimination, there has been a dramatic increase in discrimination and violence against them in the past 2 years. Attacks in June and July of 2012 resulted in the deaths of at least 57 Muslims and the destruction of 1,336 Rohingya homes. On October 23, 2012, at least 70 Rohingyas were killed and their township was destroyed. Further, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported possessing credible evidence of the deaths of at least 48 Rohingyas in January of this year, and human rights groups reported mass arrests and arbitrary detention of Rohingya in the aftermath of this violence. In addition, other Muslim minorities have also suffered from violent attacks, and many have lost their lives and property in the last year and a half. Such violence against ethnic Muslim populations, including the Rohingya, is part of a larger troubling pattern of violence against ethnic and religious minorities in Burma. The government of Burma remains apathetic to the plight of the Rohingya population and has failed to properly investigate the major events of anti-Rohingya violence. Instead, both the Rakhine state and central government continue to impose explicitly racist policies that seek to control the everyday lives of the Rohingya. Authorities require Rohingya to obtain official permission for marriages and have often singled out Rohingya for forced labor and arbitrary arrests. The government of Burma has forcefully relocated Rohingya into relief camps where they lack decent shelter, access to clean water, food, sanitation, health care, and the ability to support themselves or basic education for their children. The Rohingya are the sole targets of the two-child policy and are the subjects to severe restrictions of movement. Further, as evidenced by the latest census in Burma, the Burmese government continues to deny the Rohingyas their right for self-identification, sending a clear message that the Rohingya are outsiders who have no place in Burma. Today, approximately 140,000 Rohingya are internally displaced, and hundreds of thousands have fled to neighboring countries by boats. Many have died at sea. Those who remain in the country live in dire poverty and deprivation. Some relief used to come from humanitarian organizations like Doctors Without Borders, but even that aid is no longer available. The government of Burma expelled Doctors Without Borders in March, allegedly after the group cared for the victims of a violent assault on a Rohingya village, which the government denies ever happened. Increasingly, severe restrictions and violent attacks on other humanitarian aid groups have forced the majority of them to flee the Rakhine state, and the Rohingya now remain with no one and nowhere to turn for help and health care. Every day, more and more people die of causes that could be preventable or treatable if humanitarian groups had the chance to help. According to a March 14th article in the New York Times, nearly 750,000 people, the majority of them Rohingya, have been deprived of medical services since the Burmese government banned the operations of Doctors Without Borders. According to the article, during the first 2 weeks of March alone, about 150 of those most vulnerable and in need of care died, including 20 pregnant women facing life-threatening deliveries. When Doctors Without Borders were able to work in Rakhine, they sent approximately 400 emergency cases every month to local hospitals, but according to the World Health Organization, less than 20 people received referrals by the government for emergency care in March. Such a difference suggests that the Rohingya in desperate need of emergency care are left to suffer or to die. In light of these disturbing events, it is important that the House speak with one voice today and call on the government of Burma to end all forms of persecution and discrimination of the Rohingya people and ensure respect for internationally recognized human rights for all ethnic and religious minority groups within Burma. The Burmese government needs to recognize the Rohingya as an ethnic group indigenous to Burma and work with the Rohingya to resolve their citizenship status. And finally, the U.S. government needs to make the removal of state-sanctioned discriminatory policies a priority in their engagement with the government of Burma. Now, let me be clear. The situation is dire and rapidly deteriorating. Multiple recognized independent human rights NGOs, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Burma, have stated that the series of actions directed at the Rohingyas in Burma could amount to crimes against humanity. Further, a recent report by the U.S. NGO United to End Genocide states that nowhere in the world are there more precursors to genocide than in Burma right now. In the past few weeks, we have all taken time to remember and commemorate the victims of the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and the genocide in Rwanda. We saw the same disturbing signs in other moments of history, and we know what the consequences are of not paying attention. Showing support for this bill is one step that we can take today toward fulfilling the solemn pledge of never again. I urge my colleagues to vote in support of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve unless the gentleman from New York wants to make a closing statement at this time.
Yes.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, I'd like to thank Congressman McGovern, gentleman from Massachusetts, for drafting this important resolution. Once again, I'd like to thank him, and to Chairman Royce for his continued bipartisan leadership. As has been said, this resolution calls upon the Burmese government to end its persecution of the Rohingya people and to respect the human rights of all ethnic and religious minority groups. Until now, the treatment of the Rohingya has been largely ignored by the international community. That's the purpose of this resolution, so they cannot be ignored any longer. It's time for the United States to send a clear and strong message to the government of Burma that we will not tolerate the persecution of religious and ethnic minorities, and that it must abide by human rights principles of equality and dignity if it is to rejoin the international community. So I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for his support of the Rohingya people, but also for his dedication to human rights. I've had an opportunity to work with Mr. McGovern now on a number of different human rights bills. I think he eloquently explained tonight the challenge that we face here, and I was proud to join him as a co-sponsor of this measure and work with him. And I also, of course, want to thank the gentleman from New York, to thank Elliot Engel for his continued focus on human rights around the world. On this issue, you know, it's true that the Burmese government has recently taken steps to open its closed society. But the reality is that the recent events here are deeply, deeply troubling to anyone who is watching. As I indicated, 48 Rohingya were murdered, aid workers trying to care for thousands of displaced have been attacked in the country, Doctors Without Borders kicked out of Burma. This resolution calls on the government of Burma to immediately recognize the Rohingya as an ethnic minority and to grant them citizenship, a step that is long overdue, as Mr. McGovern pointed out. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan resolution. Let's all send a message that the current state of human rights in Burma is unacceptable. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 418 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.